afternoon. Hope everybody is well fed, had good conversations. Always have extra seats in the front. Don't worry, we won't call you out if you have to leave early or take a call outside, no problems. But we have a great group here to talk about digital infrastructure, trends, challenges, and implications. I definitely think we will have a good engaged conversation. But if somebody does have a question at the end, talk to Joyce in the back if that's okay, if she allows you to ask that question or not. I can't say yes or no, but please feel free to ask. Let me just start. We have a great group. I'll give everybody a chance to make a quick introduction, and then we'll jump into the questions. Gautam, do you want to get started?
Sure. A very warm welcome to all of you. Pleasure to be here in DC. I'm Gautam Bhandari. I'm the founder and the global CIO for I2 Capital. We are an infrastructure fund, basically an investor. We run about $40 billion of capital dedicated to equity within the infrastructure space. We run assets, we own assets, we've built assets in about 81 countries or so very global. So the outlook we have is one of, frankly, seeing the digital revolution and its impact globally. And for us, global, just to clarify, is North and South America, all of Europe, all of Asia, Australia, Japan. We don't invest in Russia and Eastern Europe, but the rest of the area, we are investors.
Cool.
Yep, Philip Marangella. I'm the Chief Marketing and Product Officer at EdgeConneX. EdgeConneX is a global data center provider. We have roughly 80 data centers or more and counting around the world. As the name implies, we started out maybe close to 15 years ago focused on the edge and building small data centers, highly distributed, bringing content closer to the eyeballs. And that was 2 to 4 megawatts, right? And over the course of time, we've certainly changed in terms of the scale because we're building 200 to 400 megawatt campuses around the world. So it's certainly a blend of both edge and hyperscale, but fundamentally the premise is the same of giving the customer what they want, where they want, when they want, and certainly how they want it in terms of the form factor.
Vice Minister.
Hi, my name is Takuo Imagawa. I'm a Vice Minister of the Ministry of Communications in Japan. It's MIC. And my ministry is in charge of telecommunications sector and also broadcasting sector, internet or media, and other digital issues, including data centers or AI and everything. And I have been in this position from July. And just for during the 2 months, July and August, I went to Brazil and Colombia and came to DC. Actually, I was in Colombia yesterday, so I just came in last night. So my job is to go to abroad and speak about our policies, and it's I believe it's going to be very much fun. So thank you for having me here.
Yeah.
So make the discussion.
Please be kind. He's definitely doesn't know what time zone he is on. So we definitely appreciate. Thank you again for making the trip up and traveling the world. So then they were nice enough to put. I got double Jonathans at the far end, but first Jonathan Frizzell from Digital Bridge.
Sure, Jonathan Frizzell, Managing Director at Digital Bridge. I oversee our global fiber investing operations. Digital Bridge is an infrastructure investor with $84 billion of dedicated capital just dedicated to the digital space. So, we basically break up the world into 3 categories, data centers, fiber, and then wireless infrastructure, towers, small cells, and the like. And then we have some other infrastructure businesses, but those are the 3 pillars. And we've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing it since the mid-90s when it used to be called telecom, but then they changed the name, and now I'm at the infrastructure conference. So very glad to be here.
Yeah. And then last, institutional investor, lead, Jonathan Atkin.
So 2 people named Jonathan and identical focus, digital infrastructure, fiber towers, data centers has defined my life for the last quarter century. And a lot of it extends into some adjacent areas around AI infrastructure, cloud computing, and so forth. So happy to happy to take the conversation wherever it goes.
Perfect. Again, appreciate all of you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be on this panel. I think, we're going to be able to talk about Asia, and, again, there's been a big hit on China, but we do want to talk about India and the other parts of Asia, data centers, AI, and just the investment cycles that we're going through, especially of, news of AirTrunk and other deals that have happened recently. The numbers keep getting bigger, but let's start off with more on the AI side to get things going, and then we can kind of dig into different parts of how that will affect digital infrastructure. But so maybe I'll start with Jonathan Frizzell. It's like, how have advancements in cloud and AI technology transformed traditional approaches to digital infrastructure from a management and scalability perspective, and how are you seeing that from the investment side?
Yeah, sure. Look, technology is the most important factor in infrastructure and the delivery of cloud and AI, right? So technology drives the demand for infrastructure. So if you think about it, we started 30 years ago with the first cell phones, and that drove the need for tower infrastructure, which then needed to get densified for LTE, 5G, ultimately 6G. You think about it on the fiber side, right? The creation of optical technologies drove, enabled global fiber networks, both terrestrial and undersea. Then when you think about cloud and AI, right, the big thing now is processing, and really it comes down to availability of power. And so, when you think about, just take it from a data center perspective, right, it used to be an outsourcing of an equipment room to a rack in a data center. That then became, the need for megawatts. And now when we talk about just for cloud alone, you're talking about the need for, 20, 30 gigawatts of power. And then you look at the next phase after that for AI, and you're talking about numbers that are 2 to 3 times the size of that. So what does that mean? It means a couple of things. It means that, the technology of data centers has to get better, right? So you think about, improvements in power densities. You have to have improvements in access to power. And quite honestly, it's not necessarily technology that we see as the big factor, but it's really the convergence of technology and power coming together, which is basically having data centers with battery capacity so that they could take on off-peak energy. But it's also getting behind the grid, because fundamentally, there's not necessarily a power generation problem in the world. There's a power transmission problem in the world. And so the key is to marry, 3 things: power, data center infrastructure, and fiber connectivity. And so putting all those 3 together is a real critical part of what we see as necessary in the future.
And then, Philip, maybe from the operator perspective and your customers, as you mentioned in your kind of intro, going from 3 to 5 megawatts to 300, or a customer going from 30 to 50 themselves on these campuses, is the requirements different, and what are you hearing as the next step?
Yeah, 100%. Just to build upon what Jonathan was saying, we as operators, I think, cloud was certainly driving a tremendous amount of demand, and we were all building out at, pretty much max capacity, and along comes AI out of nowhere, and it, as Jonathan said, doubles or triples expected demand. So power certainly becomes the long pole in the tent, and being able to get gigawatts of power, not only for today, but for tomorrow. And then as an operator, you have to think about the densities that these AI chips are requiring, and the power densities into the racks, right? And for 20 plus years, we've been cooling these things with just blowing cold air on it, and all of a sudden you're bringing in what was once taboo. You're bringing water into the data center, right? And so it's a complete redesign. It's essentially a brand new product, and you want to be sure that the data center you design doesn't become obsolete by the time it's built, because the rack densities, again, traditionally were single digits and might go up 1 or 2 kilowatts per rack over 5 years. Now you're talking about these upticks in power densities of 20, 40 kilowatts every time a new NVIDIA chip comes out. And we're blowing through triple digits on the kilowatts per rack, and we're going to see several hundred kilowatts per rack. And so how to not only be able to support that, but then operationally, you're bringing that water in, what happens when there's a leak, and SLAs and all of these kinds of things, right? So it's certainly tremendous demand, but there's certainly tremendous challenge. And I think this is what will set a lot of providers are part, is the ability to raise the capital, the ability to get the power, the ability to have the design to support the densities, and then to be able to successfully operationalize bringing water into the data center. So it's fun times for sure, and there's going to be a lot of things that's going to be affecting all of us in the digital infrastructure space.
Definitely, and then maybe we'll move to at least a question on the funding, and I'll start with Gautam on this one. Look, you are, as you say, you mentioned as a pick and shovel, a broad infrastructure investor, where Jonathan Frizzell is definitely more of a dedicated digital infrastructure investor. But so digital infrastructure is coming to favor. As Jonathan Frizzell and I used to call it communication infrastructure, or the regular telcos of the MNOs, and it became the new word of digital infrastructure, especially over the last 5 years. But as you have raised money and continue to raise money for new funds or whatever, how are the LPs looking at this? Are they starting to have a little bit of indigestion of having so much capital deployed to the sector, and the scales that the funds are getting? It used to be 2 to 5 billion was a big fund. Now it's like 5 to 10 and 15 to 20, at times. So how do your investors keep up with this, and are they still interested in the space?
Sure. Look, I mean, it's an excellent question. And so the speed of innovation has another engine, and which is availability of capital, right? So that's sort of, it's a virtuous cycle between capital and innovation and human progress. And I think initially, in the first phase of investments, people really liked digital infrastructure because it was uncorrelated with their other investments, largely, right? So within infrastructure, you could invest in power, you could invest in toll roads or airports, and how humans consume data is not completely correlated to those. So just from a pure finance perspective, it's a very nice diversifier in your portfolio, and most LPs thought of it like that. And then obviously, and they had a lot of catch up to do. So they started literally with zero, and have now most LPs have a good, let's say, 20+% of digital directly, indirectly within their portfolio. In the second stage, with the AI and the proliferation of data, and notice there's no government involvement, right? So in power, many places in the world, the state utility might help you out. There is no help out in digital. It's all private-led. So that capital requirement has gone up quite a bit. Now, interestingly, the correlation has also broken. So today, data center 2.0, as my colleague Jonathan correctly pointed out, and Philippe pointed out, are a culmination of a lot of other infra assets. I tend to view all of digital infrastructure, sort of given my science background, as electrons and photons. That's it. So you have to generate that electron, you have to somehow transmit it within the grid, capture it, run it through a server, deal with the heat loads, and then take out photons and communicate, right? So that's the essence of this. And it has become a very complicated world. Data centers are not always welcome in communities. Places where the power demand is up, or the ratepayers feel that this is going to increase their electricity bills, there is a pushback. And depending on how we all, frankly, navigate this, and the thought we put in these projects will dictate, frankly, consumer adoption of this technology to some extent. It's all nice to ask ChatGPT questions, but do you actually get the right level of LP support coming in is a function of people seeing that, okay, this is doing good for the society, and it's actually not causing undue stress on the power grid, or taking all the water out from a community, and being very careful about it. So I think people are excited, good news, lots of enthusiasm to invest, but longevity of that investment, which is the infrastructure, will depend on how we behave with that capital.
Thank you. And Jonathan Frizzell, maybe a little bit of your perspective from a digital infrastructure targeted investor, I mean, you're raising a lot of co-invest and all this, and is there still the appetite? I mean, with these large scale deals.
Yeah, look, the appetite's tremendous. Why? Because these are great, right? This is the new real estate, right? You're talking about hard assets with significant barriers to entry because of permitting, access to power, all the things that we're talking about. You're talking about, wonderful customers, investment grade customers, whose credit ratings are better than most countries, right? And then you're talking about long-term contracts alongside them, certainly in the data center space. And so it's a very attractive place for investors to invest. Now, having said that, the other thing I'd point out is that we do have $84 billion of LP capital dedicated to this, and quite honestly, they're concentrating in it. So for every dollar that goes into one of our commingled funds, we're actually seeing $2 of direct co-invest from LPs. And last year alone, I think we raised somewhere in the $7-8 billion-ish raise of new capital for projects. I think the important part here is that capital isn't the problem. I think it's the expertise is the real differentiator, right? Because you need expertise in the sponsor and the owner of that asset to make sure that that capital is being deployed smartly, as Gautam was just saying. Right? These are big capital allocations. They better be done right. So it really matters. And then second is management teams, which really matter a lot. I used to have a saying in the telecom industry that without great management, all we own is a bunch of depreciated equipment. And so it's really important to have great management teams. And take a company like Switch, which is one of the largest investments in the Digital Bridge portfolio. They haven't had an outage ever. So the company's been around for 23 years. And it's not 5.9, 6.9, 7.9. They've never had an outage. So, those are the kinds of expertise that the big customers want. They want reliability in the delivery, but they also want their projects delivered on time and on budget. And so it's really important.
No, that's as we say, it's a little bit of flight to quality across the board for these investors.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of me too's, but
yeah.
I think the LPs have been smart enough to suss out the right projects.
Very true. Let's move a little bit towards Japan. So, Vice Minister, speaking of, from a data center perspective, how does the MIC maybe get involved, or how do you see the future of the data center market in Japan from a government perspective, and any other kind of color you can provide on that?
Well, in Japan too, we are observing the increasing demand for data centers. And I would like to introduce the interesting statistics from Japan. And we are watching the data traffic over the internet, and clearly there was a sign of the data explosion or information explosion for recent maybe 20 years or so. And clearly there was a data explosion before the COVID-19. During the COVID-19, of course, there was the trend of data explosion was accelerated because everybody has to do remote communication without seeing face to face. So there was an increasing demand for the data traffic. And after the COVID-19, the pandemic, we expected it to settle down, but in fact, it was opposite. The growth rate of the data traffic was increased after the COVID-19. It was like a 20%, annually 20% growth per year, and it was a little bit higher than that during the COVID-19. Then we believe this is due to the recent use of the cloud computing and also AI, and that's why we are observing the increasing demand of data centers. But I think this increasing demand for data center is coming from the regional data centers, not the central data centers. In Japan, we have two concentrated area of data centers, Tokyo and Osaka. But we are observing the regional demand for the data centers because because of the AI technology, lot of people and a lot of the providers are trying to implement the function of AI on everywhere, on your smartphones, on the PCs, on the TVs, or on your cars and everything. And if the data processing is processed by the central data center, it takes time. There's a latency problem. So the providers would like to implement a function of AI to the edge of the network. That's why I think there is a big demand for the regional data centers. And we are supporting this movement, and we are subsidizing the implementing data centers in the regional areas.
Yeah, so I guess we will hopefully see more from Kyushu and from Hokkaido area as that develops over the next few years. But Jonathan Atkin, you've been doing lots of roadshows and tours to Asia over the last few years. And speaking of Japan, I mean, you do have a couple of the public companies there, but what do you still see the growth from your perspective, your conversations, still primary, I guess, Tokyo, Osaka, but having more exposure or thinking about a Kyushu with subsea connectivity as potential, or is it still primarily today around those major market growths?
So if you take back the kind of broaden the lens to include all of APAC outside of China, Japan would be one of 4 areas that I would expect to see most of the AI-driven growth. The velocity of the growth in Japan might be a little bit more modest compared to some of the other markets like Malaysia, India, Australia, and part of that is just due to the time it takes to build and permitting and other developments. So in the next 2 years, you may not see it, but in the next 5 years, I would expect you'd see Japan would grow into a very large AI hub, and it would basically be different areas around Tokyo, Inzai, West Tokyo, North Tokyo, and then various parts around Osaka. But some of the investments in remote areas might have a little bit of a longer tail. I think it's inevitable that you'll see some of that, but most of the actual megawatts being added will be in those 2 major metros.
And so following up, Jonathan, I'll stay with you, and we talked about the regional markets, the big 4 in the past, and what's coming up in Asia. With that, Hong Kong and Singapore has been, kind of the tier 1 markets, but look, there has been a decline because China exposure for Hong Kong and power issues and moratoriums in Singapore. What do you see as those next hubs in your conversations and what you're seeing from the power explosion? Is it just, Johor probably being one of them, but what else are you seeing?
Further down, probably Thailand, and then there's a lot of subsea cable development around the Philippines. So you've seen some recent announcements about folks getting into that market. But in terms of size, probably Thailand would be kind of a distant next after say Malaysia, and then Indonesia, just because of the size of the domestic economy, primarily around Jakarta. I don't think you're going to see Batam develop into anything more than kind of an enterprise market. So think of Johor as kind of Singapore overflow. And then Singapore, obviously, there has been some lifting of the moratorium, but the folks that now have permission to build, some of them are still just getting started. It's unclear when that is going to actually be up and running. So I think you'll see Johor eclipse Singapore in terms of actual amounts of workloads.
And then Philip, from the operator perspective, you guys are global, but the team has spent a lot of time looking at the Asia region. And there's been a big uptick of, kind of your customers from that exposure. Where are you guys kind of looking at a high level, and where are you seeing the kind of growth, the next phase growth for you?
Yeah, Asia has been kind of our most prominent in terms of growth market for us over the last 2 to 3 years. We're in China. You're still seeing tremendous demand from the domestic needs of the players there, certainly driving the growth. And it's always going to be a challenge to enter from a foreign standpoint. But nevertheless, it's still a massive market. We've invested in India, and you're seeing gigawatts of demand. It's surprised us even how much is needed there. And then, as Jonathan said, for us, we're in Malaysia. We're in a number of markets: Johor, Cyberjaya, Bukit Jalil, and downtown KL. So we see that tremendous demand across all of those sub-markets in Malaysia, and then Jakarta as well we went in there with a small acquisition, and we've just been nothing but growth in hundreds of megawatts. So those obviously are, just between those 4 gigawatts of demand, right? And then you add in Japan. Obviously, we're looking at Japan. Some of the challenges there is just the power. As we talked about earlier, at the scale that we need and the time we need it, it's a challenge, right? So you're looking at alternatives within Japan that were alluded to as well. But the whole region is booming. And if you look at, relative to, say, Europe, which, as obviously we have a lot of demand there, but you have different challenges, in terms of regulatory headwinds and power availability and so forth. So as you compare and contrast those 2 markets, you're certainly see Asia seeing a lot of growth and demand far outpacing a more traditional market like Europe.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah,
I'd like to add one thing for this discussion. With the demand of the data center, we are facing the importance of pipes between data centers. So we are also observing the increasing demand for the optical fiber and also submarine cables. That's a big issue.
Yeah, that's I manage the investment in Zayo, which is one of the 2 largest independent fiber players in the US. And because we're Digital Bridge and we're also a leader globally in data centers, we get a front row to this. The discussions we're having now with some of the hyperscale customers I'll give you an example. We got approached collectively to say, okay, we want to build a fiber connection between the West Coast and the Midwest, because we've got 2 AI hubs. We've got our main hub is on the West Coast. We've got an AI hub in the middle of the country. And we want you to route that network any place where you could connect power and build a data center. So as you think about it, right, and that's what we're seeing real time. And this is not a small project. This is just on the fiber side, it's a $500 million project just for that side of it. And then if you include the data centers, it's multiples of that. And so that's the way they're starting to think right now is, how those all come together. And that's why it's really important for how networks are getting designed. And you have to be thinking big picture. And some of the companies, quite honestly, they're segmented and they're trying to do this in bits. And I think over time, to your point, you're going to have to be thinking about this on a combined basis, because I think it's really important from that perspective. And then when you think about the future with when AI finally moves to the inference state for our edge friends here, right? Then the move is going to be less about power, and then it's going to be about lower latency, and that's where towers and edge data centers come in over time. And so, it's a really, really, really fascinating time, but it's one that the winners here will be the ones that, I assume you agree with this, that see the whole picture.
So I'd just add too, right? You make a good point, Jonathan. Even here in the States, power is challenging and constrained, right? Even
I was just about to jump to that.
Okay, go ahead.
No. I mean, and that's perfect. It's like, and that's the question is like, well, will we have enough power in the world to feed AI needs? Yeah. Now, is literally as you start to say about that is, and from your perspective as being the operator and Jonathan Frizzell and Gautam, as you're saying, connecting the dots between fiber, passing power, having land near a data center, or a general infrastructure investor of doing renewables to power generation. Like we'll take Philip. Why don't you start with that? But it's a good question because it's coming up everywhere with regards to access to power and then getting approvals for power.
Yeah, look, I live in Ashburn, so I, for once, have the shortest commute to a conference, which is nice. But it's insane. My neighbors give me a hard time about all the data centers, right? And I'm like, hey, look, you got never have a power outage, you got wicked fast internet, and your taxes are low. So, whatever. But even here, right? I have to be honest. Even when I drive to work, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of cranes and a lot of data centers, and it's starting to expand beyond Ashburn just because of power constraints with Dominion, right? And you're seeing that in Atlanta, and you're seeing that in some of these traditional big data center markets. And so what's now happening, certainly for the big hyperscale, the big large language model deployments for AI, are going to markets you've never heard of just because they have power. And that's becoming, our calculus on what's a good market starts and begins with power availability and so forth. And certainly renewable is a big issue. That's one of the advantages we have in India with our partner being able to bring gigawatts of renewable energy to power our data centers in India. But it's totally changed in terms of kind of where we go and how we bring capacity online in terms of the scale and the power requirements.
I would add to that. I think, as I said, this is all about electrons and photons, right? So when you start with electrons, you need to figure out a way to generate them. And the grid infrastructure in the US and many other in Europe in particular are not designed to take gigawatts of loads at a specific point, right? They're designed for households in a reasonably spread out industrial complex. So we're now basically putting smelters, right? Jointly packed smelters everywhere. So we view this as a fund, as an electron-photon problem, and we start with the basics of actually producing renewable power. We're one of the largest deployer of renewable energy, 18 plus gigawatts, 9 gigawatts under construction. Because at the end of it, you don't get that right, there will be a consumer pushback. So you have to get that right, Then the second thing you have to do is you have to stabilize the grid. So a grid operator whose job is resiliency is not particularly excited to get a very challenging problem. So you have to actually offer him a solution so that his grid is able to absorb that heavy concentrated load. We have to solve the water problem. So we have water infrastructure companies to do it. So what started off as a very nice industry about communication and probably fiber is now becoming increasingly codependent and drawing on all the sets of infrastructure. And then in Asia in particular, we have data centers in Indonesia and Singapore, in Taiwan and China also. It's also fiber connectivity, the basic fiber connectivity that you rely on, including subsea connectivity, which is increasingly political. How do you get that right? And you're not totally dependent on a single fiber provider. So you are the neutral provider of fiber. And to get all of that right in different geography is super important. And he who solves it properly in a more sustainable way, I think will be eventually the right long-term winner in this. And there'll be several winners, but I hope the industry heads into that direction.
I think,
Yeah, I would maybe to kind of crystallize, I think it's energy transmission in most cases. Energy generation, I think it's anybody's guess as to what the AI growth will be, in 2027, 2028. I think some of the big hyperscalers that have been among the biggest procurers of NVIDIA equipment that's yet to even be installed, when that goes end of life and they have to face billions of refresh investments, they're going to have a view as to whether there's been a return on that investment or not. So I think we kind of have to wait to see how the big, the Microsofts, Googles, Oracles, and Amazons behave with their capital budgets out that far to find out what the longer term growth looks like. But in the medium term, I'd say it's primarily transmission, and that can be a very long fix. So in Loudoun County, I think this crisis started in July, August of 2022. It's going to get solved maybe December of next year when one of the transmission lines comes ready for service. And I think there'll be a lot more capacity that can come online starting in 2026 just in Loudoun County. And then we'll see whether we need to build more transmission infrastructure. But that will have been a 3.5 year fix. And in other jurisdictions, it might be 2 years. In Santa Clara, where I'm based, it's going to be a lot longer. But there's not just the investment the utility has to make, but then building substations that requires transformers. Lead times on that can be measured in years. So that's one long pole. And then the other one would be the fiber intercity route investments. I guess a question I would have for the other Jonathan is, how long will it take Zayo to complete these two endpoints end to end? Is that going to be measured in quarters or years or?
Yeah, I mean, it's in quarters to years, right? Not many years, right? They're big projects, and you connect them and you do them in phases, and sometimes you'll pre-route by leasing fiber until you build your own. But the demands we're starting to see on the fiber side are, right, we're having our best booking quarters ever. And in fact, when we talk about the evolution of Zayo, right now we're kind of use this phase as the, building the biggest basket because the manna is coming from heaven, sort of way with the size of some of these deals. And so, I think that is where we're really focusing, is to provide those solutions and do it in a comprehensive way. And so it's, we're prepared to make the investment. The other thing is that the customers are making that investment too. So to get projects done, they're actually, funding more of the upfront capital than they have historically to make sure that those projects get done and get prioritized.
And I guess one more on the power is that there has been some talk about nuclear again. On micro nuclear reactors, there's been some investment. Unfortunately, we'll say on the Japan side, there's been a little bit of a slow turning back nuclear on after 3/11/11 of the tsunami. But really, John Frizzell, I mean, as you see, this can the intersection of fiber, data center, and then it gets to power and water. Are there, is that something that you're seeing more interest, or is it, as you say, can you get closer to the power generation rather than being far away with dealing with the issues of transmission?
Yeah, look, the power and water are obviously issues, and in parts of the U.S. there are issues of getting access to water in the Western U.S. In some cases. In Asia there are water issues as well. Look, on the nuclear side, the technology is still in its early days, particularly, and I'll defer to my colleague on the physics. But certainly, nuclear is an interesting solution, but I think it's earlier in its deployment, and I think the regulatory side of it is going to be long, right? I think it's similar to what you've seen in things like autonomous vehicles and things like that. The proving cycle, and then the adoption, and then the government approval of that, I think, is going to be a long cycle. So we look at that not in the months or years, but probably in the more in the decade threshold. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Look, so NuScale and others have these modular reactors. They're well known. In fact, many nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers have similar small power plants. The problem is, frankly, just regulation, right? To get it regulated and put in place in a time frame at which AI is developing, I don't see it happen. So I'm a kind of a black and white person. I don't see it. And I think there's plenty of unused hydro and other things that you actually can do something about right now, right? US has, I think, over 8,000 dams that have no turbine in them. So give you an idea of low-hanging fruit that's available. So I think those will be the first order solutions. Longer term, if these learning models, because they don't level off, so I think you should probably run them for a long-term solution. But those types of things, I think it's like 5+ years.
Let's kind of change up and go back towards AI. And I think I'll stick with you, Gautam, on this one. Is what do you see as the key challenges or opportunities associated with the integration of cloud and AI technologies for the digital ecosystem, digital infrastructure,
right,
as we move this forward?
Look, I think like with every new thing that comes up, there's rapid periods of advancement, very initial periods of advancement. I think the first thing that comes to mind is, not all AI business models are sustainable. So right now, I think if you just have AI in your name, you get more market cap than, frankly, P&L. And so that makes perfect sense for people to experiment with it, which is great, right? I mean, that's how you start, so that's great. I think this integration of everything, as my colleagues have said, down to who will provide that substation, how will the grid manage this, right? How much of the workload can we put in there? And then, of course, longer term, there are issues of social and other things. But I think overall, this very fine integration, which this industry has never faced, to be blunt, right? This was a very simple, let's build a complex data center, let's do the best job, let's make it very efficient, and then we'll have the communication, right? So the fiber and the data center sort of went hand in hand. Now you have power, and within power, suddenly it's not just generation, it is grid stabilization. It's the substation, right? So we have started investing in companies that actually just do the simple things of making sure your substation can get built in 3 to 6 months, not 3 to 6 years, right? Because a utility is not designed to do this on demand. A utility is designed to make sure your residential electricity doesn't go off. So I think getting those things right is a massive, massive effort. A lot of that basics of substation and US grid in particular, as well as the European grid, is super old. It's 40 years old, right? And nobody likes a big substation in the backyard. And frankly, substation manufacturing is not particularly done in the US. So sourcing those simple things, can get quite challenging. And that is the critical bottleneck. So obviously very talented people to integrate it together, and then reshoring some of that industry and restarting it to make sure that you think of it from the grid's perspective and those things. I think that's pretty critical.
And Jonathan Atkin, do you have more color on what do you see as some of those challenges or opportunities around cloud and AI technologies for the infrastructure or the kind of the ecosystem?
Yeah, and harking back a little bit on I think what Philip was saying, but cloud and then social networking, which happened maybe concurrently, but it did lead to these massive bursts in demand. I think what we saw back then though was a little bit of a digestion period where the barriers to entry to developing, particularly the data center infrastructure, were significant, but capital and land and power were relatively easier to access then. And so there were periods where you did encounter sufficient supply to meet the demand. And then in some cases, even the demand started to kind of level off a little bit. It wasn't too long ago that some of the major cloud providers started to show a bit of a deceleration in their revenue growth rate as their customers started to optimize their workloads. But what I see with AI is another 2 years at least of really strong demand. And then as we've talked about with energy being the constraint primarily, still a lot of limited supply. So I think for those that are able to participate in the industry with inventory to sell, that's high density and meets the standard, I think you're going to see very good pricing development. And so just to take Loudoun County as an example, pricing essentially has doubled since 2021 because of exactly these issues that we've talked about. In Europe, we're in our third straight year of double-digit percentage price increases. And then across Asia, it's a little bit more nuanced because we didn't see quite the trough in pricing. But even in Asia, at worst, pricing has stabilized, and in some markets, it's starting to increase as a result.
I'll just add, too, I think it will be interesting. You're kind of touching on it a little bit, too, Jonathan, is the business cases for AI. It will, look, the investment from a data center perspective is significant, hundreds of millions and billions and tens of billions of dollars to support the gigawatts. But if you think about the chips and the infrastructure that goes in to support it, that, you talk about a refresh period and you're spending billions on these chips and gear that go into the data center. I feel that really the hyperscalers are going to be the key benchmark to demonstrate an ROI for all that investment. And you have a lot of new players coming in, look, I'm old, hence the lack of hair and the gray beard. Like, I used to work at Nortel, so I lived through that kind of bad business model of vendor
Anybody know
financing.
Nortel out there? Just
Yeah. So there's probably a large alumni.
Yeah, there's a few probably out there.
Yeah, and I remember, like, you know, and you
West
know,
Virginia?
they were going to get that back, but you know, justifying the GPU per hour and so forth, the math is hard to make happen, right? It kind of defies science there.
Financial
So
logic too.
it'll be interesting to see. I think, John, you're touching on a good point. Like in 2 or 3 years, as like the dust settles a little bit, what happens in the phase 2 in terms of AI, right? So.
No, and we'll go on to CapEx and a few other things in a few minutes. But wanted to give the Vice Minister to talk about the Japan policy of AI. Has there been already debates? Is there early discussions of where there's a framework? Where do you see the government perspective at this point? I know it's probably not set in stone, it's still being reviewed, but where do you see Japan giving their blessing or their concerns of AI?
Well, regarding AI, because I'm only policy guy, I have to mention a little bit about the regulation or some sort of things. And we understand there are a lot of merits from using AI, but we are also observing the risks and the concerns of using AI, especially after generative AI. So last year, as a G7 chair, we promoted the international discussion about the AI governance. And we need a very good balance between the development of AI and the utilization of AI and regulation of AI. So we need we have to pursue the good balance of regulation and development utilization. And we are promoting so-called Hiroshima AI process. And we, as a result, after the discussion, we got the international guiding principles and the international code of conduct. So this is a kind of soft law, but a lot of countries, including EU, are discussing about how to regulate the use of AI. So we need some, international framework to discuss and implement some rules and guidelines, that kind of things. And also, cloud computing is also becoming the kind of social infrastructure. So maybe the players of cloud computing also required to have some social responsibility for that.
No, there's a lot more we can say on that. I think pivoting a little bit to Jonathan Atkin on data sovereignty, and that's another part that's been kind of debated and discussed as data centers, even in Asia or other regions, kind of were centralized. But in what way is data sovereignty being considerations changing the investments in markets, and what are you seeing? Is there the U.S., China, and Chinese tech companies and social media is one part of it, but then also from local governments saying, I need data onshore. And we saw that in Asia because Indonesia used to pretty much have all its data sitting in Singapore, and then they planted a flag saying local data needs to be onshore. Are you seeing that more and more happen?
Yeah, I think it's continuing. I think in Europe, the Edward Snowden revelations were a big accelerant of causing some of the hyperscalers to put smaller clusters sooner in countries that they maybe were further down the roadmap. So that happened in the last decade, and then Asia, it looks different, but India has had a lot of movement and talk about data sovereignty, and it depends on whether it relates to financial institutions or customer data. But I think the ambiguity itself around the Indian data sovereignty has forced a lot of investment onshore, because hyperscalers like Meta, not knowing what the regulation might look like, to de-risk themselves would decide to get in. And then you have, the China thing that you mentioned. Project Texas is basically the name that you'll find on TikTok's website about how they are working with Oracle to, put stuff here in the U.S. and address some of the security concerns. And then Project Clover is the exact same initiative, but in the EU, where ByteDance is also making big investments. And there's been some publicly, some articles about maybe Australia being next. So I think partnering with local custodians of the data, is certainly being attempted as a way to to address local sensitivities, whether it's cultural or governmental, around foreign investment in Western countries.
Philip, are you seeing it from the DC operator perspective, either where you're building or the type of customer mix that you can have at certain locations?
Yeah, I think the EU is a good example that Jonathan talked about, that, you had the flat D markets, if you will, and you're seeing a lot more builds, even though, we're big in Amsterdam, but you're also seeing Brussels, right? Number one. Number two, I think why you're seeing more AI investment in Asia right now is that the unknown around data sovereignty. So before committing, billions of dollars into certain markets in Europe, they're going to slow roll it just to see how it plays out. So that's certainly affecting the decision for our customers of what they put and where and so forth.
All right, I know we're running out of time, so we'll just finish up with one kind of more fully overarching question. Mike hit on a few different things because, as we've all talked about, it's the data growth and the transmission, collection, analytics of data, either through subsea, fiber, data centers. In either U.S. or regional or APAC, as we talk, what should be the emphasis from operators and or government as we go forward across this? And maybe I'll give Gautam a chance to kind of say is what is that overarching emphasis? Is it around governments, the power? Is it about the partnerships to help between the data center operators, the power providers, fiber? Where do you see that kind of next emphasis and focus around for some of the players here?
Look, I think if AI and all these wonderful technologies have to get adopted, you want a very sustainable ecosystem, frankly, right? So you want a system where not just the consumers, but the grid operators and the fiber providers, the data center operators, the OTTs, the innovators can all do it in somewhat of a sustainable way. So we are in phase one of the gold rush. So frankly, people don't care where they dig, as often happens when you find gold. But later on, the long-term winners are the ones who were thoughtful about all these big questions, right? So to just give you an example, right? A lot of data centers are migrating to Texas. Texas grid power demand has gone ERCOT, which is the Texas grid. It's actually not connected to any other US grid, uniquely Texas. It's up 7%, right? Power demand in US is generally flat to 1% for the last 20 years, right? So suddenly you have an entire generation of engineers that has never seen their grid consumption going up 7%, who now have to figure out how to balance it, right? So getting that whole thing right, and then there are, of course, the social ramification. And more importantly, as you build these data centers, if you look at the carbon footprint of some of these things, right now, all the numbers are up for each one of the OTTs. So they've just done it because of necessity. Over time, this will get reversed as they put more green on the grid. But that's just scope one. If you go back and look at scope 2 and scope 3 is up massively. And I think that's where really people need to emphasize and really think about, yes, I did get my project, kudos. We got it before others, kudos. But is it a sustainable project? Did you invest the time and the effort to make sure that the scope 3 emissions were also, sustainable? That's something that if it came to light, you were proud of. And I think if we get that right, this is wonderful. This is great. It will transform human race, transform how we work. If we don't get it right, I think there will be a very understandable pushback.
No, I think maybe a few more, and we'll finish this up, Philip. And
Yeah.
maybe Jonathan Frizzell to finish up. If you have any
I'll say this too, right? In terms of pushback, right? We are seeing that, right? We're seeing communities, we're seeing regulators and so forth push back. And there's this notion that we're just, data centers are evil and taking all this power and all this kind of stuff, right? And I have to remind folks of what data centers enable, right? In terms of the infrastructure and the services and the things like cloud and AI and so forth that affect every individual, right? Every company, every vertical. And in turn, they themselves can become greener and more efficient. Farmers can have better harvest and yield and get faster to market and so forth. Airlines can figure out better routes and timing and use less gas and fuel and all that kind of stuff. And you go down the list, right? Every industry is positively impacted by what data centers enable. And we have to, this is where I put my marketing hat, is tell those stories, those anecdotes, so they understand that, yes, that this consumes a lot of power, but we're taking away from all these other industries and reducing their carbon footprint as a result. And I think that's, as we as an industry need to collectively educate and inform obviously communities and regulators to the positive impacts that data centers have, not just how much power we're necessarily consuming. So,
Jonathan, do you have any last comments before we finish?
Sure. I mean, you've heard me say it about, the way we think about it with operators in terms of integration. I think that when you think about it on a local, state and local or regional or country or nation specific basis, it's about coordinating the right incentives to get the right infrastructure built in coordination, right? So you want to have the right incentives to have the right operators come in, whether it be tax incentives, whether it be the right regulatory environment. You want to permit the right projects in the right locations. And you want to look at them. You can't, as I said, compartmentalization is the worst thing you could do here, right? You have to look at the big picture and say, okay, where are we going to, where is this power going to go? Where is this data center going to go? Is it in the right spot? Have we permitted the right connectivity? The comment that's been made several times here is about transmission, right? Can we bypass transmission? So that way we're permitting where there are areas where we don't have the same demand. And so I think it requires a lot of comprehensive work, but I think the ones that do it well will actually benefit and will incentivize the right activity. And if you think about it, I mean, you know this as well as anyone, right? The economic activity that gets created not only by the applications that we drive in terms of cloud and AI, but also the construction of the infrastructure and the networks and everything that support it. I mean, it's a very pro-economic industry, and so it's really, really important that regulators see that, embrace it, but are smart about how they do it.
Well, I appreciate these last comments. Again, please give a little bit of round of applause to our great panel. Thank you very much for everybody.